Good evening, and thank you all for being here. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Jensen. I'm a professor of chemistry here at Aquinas College. The Contemporary Writers series at Aquinas has been bringing writers of all literary genres to campus since 1997. The featured writers meet with students for informal discussions during the day of their visit, and then the evening presentations are free and open to the public, which benefits the Grand Rapids community at large. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by the Jane Hibbard Idema Women's Studies Center at Aquinas College. The mission of that center is to serve as a community resource for women's and gender issues, to promote awareness of those issues through programs and curriculum, and to empower students and community members to become advocates for gender equality and social justice. Our speaker tonight studied journalism at the University of Georgia and science writing at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. For over 30 years, she has worked for magazines and newspapers around the country, including the Sacramento Bee, where she won a Pulitzer Prize in 1992 for her series investigating ethical issues in primate research. Her first book, The Monkey Wars, was based on that investigation. Her later books have explored the biological differences between men and women, the psychology of child development, the paranormal, and most recently, the early development of forensic science. She has also co-edited a field guide for science writers. From 1997 to 2015, she was a professor in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And since 2015, she has been the director of the Knight Science Journalism program at MIT. I think that writing about science must be really hard. If you just think about that, first, you have to learn about the science itself so that you understand it well enough to communicate what you know to other people. And this is often where scientists themselves stop, because we mostly communicate with other scientists, and it's pretty easy to talk to other people when they're all in your club. Right? You all know the same vocabulary, the same jokes. You have a shared experience. But the science writer has to go one step further and figure out how to tell those scientists' stories to people who don't know very much about that subject, and sometimes who are afraid or hesitant about science. So the science writer has to find a way to tell those stories in an especially compelling way, a way that blends an engaging narrative with the information of the science. And so I think that makes the science writer someone who performs a tremendous service for our culture, maybe a little bit like a translator, helping the scientist communicate her science to the public, but on the other hand, helping the public understand what is the value and the meaning of the science itself. It feels today like, to many people, like science is becoming more and more specialized, more and more overwhelming. How can anybody really keep up with it? But on the other hand, the decisions and the choices we make day to day are increasingly dependent on science and technology. So it's of more and more importance that people understand all of these things, or at least enough of these things to make good choices. So tonight, we're going to hear from Deborah Blum, who has been doing this tremendous work for a long time. And before I leave, I just want to remind you to please turn off your phones if you have not already. And after the talk tonight, there will be a book signing out here in the hallway, so you have an opportunity to obtain a copy of some of the books, and I hope you enjoy that as well. But for now, please welcome Deborah Blum.
I'm short, I have to do this. It really is an honor to be here. I am so excited to be here at Aquinas College. I would like to thank both the Contemporary Writers program and the Women's Studies program for bringing me here. I have only been on the East Coast now for about 2.5 years, so it's also really special for me to come back to the Midwest. And I was going to make a snow joke, but when I talked to my husband in Boston, he was out shoveling, and so I just won't bother to do that. What I want to do instead is talk to you about writing about science, why I love it, why I think it's so important, and to also walk you through a couple of things. I'm going to start by just talking about some of the challenges that we face in science writing today and the kind of internal discussion we have about how to best tell stories of science, what are some of the obstacles involved with that, and then I'm going to also walk you through some of the ways that I've tried to address these challenges in a number of the different books that I've written. And the last thing I'm going to do is talk about that a little with a book that I've written that hasn't come out yet, but will be out in September. So you actually are the first audience that I have ever showed the coming up cover of the book and talked about some of the issues in it, which is kind of fun for me. So let's see if this sucker. Okay, so this is actually is not great art, right? But it is part of a series of lectures that is provided by Penn State, in which they are training their scientists to talk to the public. And then, as you see, the real point of it is scientists are thinking apple and the public is thinking orange. And so the message to the scientists is basically that your non-scientist public is not going to understand what you say, and they're going to hear something different from what you're hearing, which is kind of a daunting thing to tell anyone. As a science writer, I think this is only partly true. I mean, not everyone understands specialized jargon, but my feeling when I go out and write about science is that indeed there are a lot of people out across the country and a lot of people in this room who are not scientists who understand a lot about it. But it's one of the things that we kind of wrestle with is our perception that when this goes in both directions, that we're not going to really understand what scientists are saying. They're not going to understand what we're thinking. And with that can come some kind of hostility over do they think they're smarter than we are, which tends to make people kind of reject some of the ideas. So the next thing I want to show you, come on, baby. Oh, wait. Is a really great slide, which oh, here it is. So this is from a series of surveys that the Pew Research Center did, in which they were looking at some of the differences between scientists and the general public. And this was a fairly simple approach in which they went out and talked to members of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. You see this over here, AAAS scientists, and then U.S. adults representing people who were not practicing scientists. And what it really shows you when you start looking at this is that there's these enormous differences in agreement on what the science is saying. So for instance, if you go to the top, a lot of this is really contentious areas of science, but if you go to the top, GMO foods, they're safe to eat. You have 37% of US adults saying that. You have 88% of scientists saying that. There's this enormous difference in what people are thinking, and this runs to different degrees through a lot of these. Foods with pesticides, you're going to see a similar gap. I mean, again, there's evolution here, there's vaccines, you go down here, there's climate change. These are a lot of contentious issues. And my favorite part of it is the one thing that apparently the general public and scientists agree on is the space station was a good investment for the United States, but at everywhere else you see this incredible gap. So one of the things that we try to wrestle with as science writers is, I'm going to quote scientists, how much credibility do they have with the public, and who's going to listen to what they're saying, and how do I, because I'm really interested in the actual evidence of the story, present that in a way that it doesn't feel like it's a big fat lecture. And if you drill these down even more, I love this slide. I don't know why. This is really looking very specifically at GMO foods. So again, you're going to see this kind of gap. 57% of US adults think they're generally unsafe. Scientists do not agree with that. And My favorite part of the slide is you go down here where you say to the public, where the surveyor said to the general public, well, you know, scientists tend to think, and so the answer of the American public is, well, scientists just don't understand the science, right? So clearly the problem is not me, but it's the scientists. And so this becomes, when you're writing a story about science, sorry about this, I'm gonna, something where as a science writer you're thinking, okay, this is really important science, there's some amazing research, how am I going to tell this as a story in a way that people are really going to hear what the important message is? And this can be a real problem. I picked this slide because it makes me laugh, but this is a huge problem, especially in some of these issues. And I picked vaccines, and I just want to talk briefly about it in terms of the current flu season. So if you are following the flu season, right, you know that the current vaccine has not protected everyone from the flu. Why is that? Because the flu vaccine is a cocktail, right? It's a cocktail of what a bunch of scientists the previous year think are going to be the leading strains, and the vaccine or the flu shot is a mix of a bunch of different protective, attenuated viruses to build up your immunity to those viruses. This year's shot is 100% effective against all the influenza B strains. So no one who is getting sick is getting influenza B if they got the shot. It is 100% effective against H1N1, which was the big pandemic that killed hundreds of people a few years ago. And it is 100% effective against some, but not all, of the influenza A viruses. And the virus that's giving us a lot of trouble this year is an A virus. It's influenza A. It's called H3N3, if you care. And it just turns out that the way we make viruses is not a good match for H3N3, and this is a particularly bad virus. It's fairly mutant, but the vaccine is somewhere around between 17 and about 30% effective against that virus. So here's where you really drill down with the shot. If you get the flu shot, you get some minimal protection against that virus, even if you get the flu. So the latest numbers from this vaccine show that this vaccine is notable this year because it's killing a lot of younger people, which is unusual for flus. Usually it kills older people. This year it's killed 50 children, 12 and under. 90% of those kids did not get the shot. So of the children who have died from this flu, most of them did not get the shot, which tells you that for other children who got the flu, the shot was probably protective. You're never going to be able to get this effectively. I'm going to say it's difficult to get this message across. It's complicated. So if I'm making a case, which I would like to make, get your flu shot every year, you'll be glad. Real influenza is a terrible infection, right? We are always talking about stomach upsets as stomach flus. They're not even related, right? So, but it's how do I tell that story in a way that convinces people that this shot is going to be effective? So one of the things, eventually I'm going to move this guy forward, that I also want to say is that works in our favor is that people actually do want this information. So this is from the same Pew Research Center thing, and what you see when you look at what people want to know is that health and medical is number 3, science and technology is number 4, and I was really surprised when I saw this because you see that they are way ahead of sports and entertainment, which I actually did not see coming. So we know people want the information, and some of it is how we're going to provide the information, right? And so there's a reason why this matters. This is from the March for Science in Minneapolis in 2016. And the basic point of that sign is this. Science is a hugely transformative force in society and on the planet today, and we're watching it transform every single day. It changes the planet, It changes our lives. I mean, this is different from the Planet B issue, but at MIT where I am, the number one thing that people are looking at right now is the transformation from artificial intelligence. Right, so not just self-driving cars and not just the fact that now you're on Gmail, it makes suggestions for how you should answer, right? And not just all of these other things, but eventually they're developing, a lot of bots that, they have writing bots actually, and they're developing a lot of bots that are taking jobs at newspapers at the moment, for instance. Amazon just pioneered a grocery store, you probably saw this in Seattle, that is 0 staff, and you don't check out. The store watches you as you go through the store. And when you leave with whatever you've put in the pocket, the store charges you for it, right? So we're looking at AI as a hugely transformative force. We need this information, and we need to make smart decisions about it, and we need to know how to navigate the world here on planet A as science and technology rewrites the rules of how we live here. So what I want to talk to you about now is how a narrative writer like myself tries to make people think about science, tries to introduce science into the conversation in a way that is never going to be a lecture, and tries, and this is always underlying for me, to say this is really cool stuff, right? It's not scary, it's not hard, it's part of your everyday life. It's really cool stuff, and so to do that, I have to take you back about 100 years. And this is New York City in 1918, which is the start of my most recent book, The Poisoners Handbook. If you've been in Manhattan recently, you'll know that train, which is the 3rd Avenue elevated, no longer exists, right? This is The Poisoners Handbook. This is, I just put this up there because I think they're interesting in their different designs. Poisoners Handbook was a documentary on American Experience on PBS, and so the cover artist for the book made the test tube a moon hanging over New York City, right, which I always thought was super cool, but the cover artist for PBS made the poisons a toe tag. And so when you go down it says cyanide and arsenic. And I thought that was, I have zero talent this way, but it's really fun to look at the differences. So what I'm going to do to kind of give you an example of how I like to tell a story is to take you back. This is also from 2018. Take you back to 2018 and ask you, by the end of this story, I'm going to ask you to actually function as an early 20th century forensic detective and solve a murder for me. And this is a real murder. But this particular photograph is from the New York City Municipal Archives. It actually is a crime scene from 2018. It's what you think of as a statement killing. This was a gangster killing that was, kill the guy, put him in the pipe, leave him in a public park, and make a statement, don't mess with me. So I always think of these as statement killings. And what's really interesting about this photograph is the guy over there in the black hat is the police officer, and there's a couple other police officers, but you will see no scientists. There are no forensic scientists. There's no one taking measurements. There's no one who's going to study this body, because in 1918 there were no forensic scientists in New York. And in fact, in the rest of the country, forensic science is a really new, forensic crime-solving science is really new in this country, and we did not actually start training people in forensic medicine here until 1933. And so at this period, what they had were appointed coroners, politically appointed coroners. And in New York, in 1918, these were appointed by the fairly corrupt political machine, Tammany Hall, so that anyone who was a coroner was someone who had done a favor for the political machine. And so when you look at the roster of coroners who were asked to sign death certificates, they were sign painters and milkmen and lawyers and bakers and anyone who had given money or done a favor for the political machine. And there was no one who knew anything about science except for a few doctors who had killed so many patients they had lost their practice. And so they then were picked up by Tammany Hall, and the chief coroner of New York City this year was a doctor named Patrick Reardon, who was such a famous alcoholic that if you go back and you look at the newspapers of the time, he always has 2 assistants holding him upright at crime scenes. So, and because there is this incredible sort of amateur hour of coroners, a lot of the times the coroner didn't even come to the scene of death. And so when you go back, and the National Academy of Sciences did a nationwide survey on this, and you look at causes of death on death certificates at the time, you will literally find ones that say, could be diabetes or possibly an auto accident. And you're going, what? Right? Or they'll just go, act of God. And so, which it could have been, right? It could have been an act of God, but that's not actually going to help you solve a murder. And the other thing these guys would do, because they were very corrupt, is they would sell the cause of death. So one of my favorite hear me? There. Was one in which a guy had committed suicide, put the gun here, bullet blew out the top of his head, and the death certificate said ruptured aneurysm. So, and we know that something probably ruptured in the course of this, but basically his family did not want him to be a suicide, and so they had bought the death certificate. And so you find cops like this saying, please don't let your so-called scientists near my crime scenes because they're always screwing it up and they're always making it up. And later this year, 1918, the city of New York, the state of New York forced the city to hire their first chief medical examiner, who was actually a doctor. This is what a modern laboratory looked like at this point, by the way. And he's the big guy, kind of sitting down with a spade-like beard looking out the window. And the guy standing next to him is Alexander Gettler. Charles Norris is the medical examiner. Alexander Gettler was the first toxicologist ever to work for an American city. And so the Poisoners Handbook is about this period in which they are trying to figure out how to catch poisoners. And when Norris was hired, the city of New York had actually just issued a report that said the clever poisoner can operate with impunity in New York City, which is not a message I would have given out publicly, but was true. So there's a lot of poisons. I'm going to briefly mention my favorite, which is arsenic. Arsenic is a great poison. It's like, well, I love it in a kind of subjective way. Why do I like it? It's the most famous poison in America, in human homicidal history. It dates back to the Borgias. What made it a great poison? So what makes a great poison, right? Arsenic is tasteless. During the 19th century, scientists could mix it into things like vanilla pudding, and you can't taste it at all. It's odorless. It mimics the symptoms of a natural illness. So you just mix it into a little bit of someone's food every day, they get a little sick. And here's the other thing. In the early 19th century, there were no tests at all to detect a poison in a corpse. So arsenic was so frequently diagnosed as just natural illness that in the 19th century in Europe, it was known as the inheritance powder. It was hugely commonly used. And it was the first poison that scientists figured out how to detect in a dead body. And as soon as that happened, poisoners in general started shifted over to plant poisons, right, which were not detectable. And the first plant poison that was detectable in a human body was nicotine, and that was at 1870. And then we had the rise of the industrial age, and now we have a sea of industrial toxic chemicals that no one knows anything about. And, come on, baby. On the other hand, arsenic is really fun to look at, and we could watch it for a very long time. There we go. And arsenic is super easy to get, right? So arsenic, a lot of women took arsenic to improve their complexion. That's what this is. And so you get this bizarre mixed message about what arsenic is, but also it's in every house, right? It's just in your cosmetic drawer. And so on the morning that you were really ticked off at your husband, you'd go and you'd get a bunch of harmless arsenic wafers, put them in his cereal. He wouldn't be able to taste them. He'd die of something that looked like a naturally occurring illness, and off you'd go, right? It was a fabulous poison. This is why I like it so much. But the poison I'm going to talk about now is a different one. And so this is a case from 1923. If you recognize this kind of picture, this was the tenement district of New York on the Lower East Side. These were really poor kind of areas. They had lots of, there we go, lots of families living in these, come on baby. Oh well, skip the family. This is what a typical apartment would look like. This is from the Tenement Museum in New York right now. And so they were very poor. I mean, they had a lot of peeling paint. They had gas lighting. So one of the things that people don't realize that in the 1920s, we weren't all running on electricity despite the wonders of GE and everything else. A lot of people who couldn't afford it just used gas lighting, and they used gas lighting in their apartments. They used the same gas. It was called illuminating gas to power their refrigerators and stoves. In New York, there were about 1,000 deaths a year from accidents with illuminating gas. So why do you think illuminating gas was so dangerous? Because it consisted of hydrogen, which was explosive, and carbon monoxide, which is poisonous. And back in the day, they did not actually put, as we do now, we will put, like on your stove when you're working with natural gas, if you somehow have your pilot light dies and your burner is going, you're going to smell it. But that's not the carbon monoxide. We add a compound called chloropicrin so that we can detect it. But in this case, it was not poisonous. So in the story I want to tell you, and this is another dead body from the New York City Municipal Archive. This is not our story. You, the forensic chemist, are called to a crime scene. You're just going to have to mentally step over that body and go into the apartment, which looks something like the one I showed you. But when you get into the apartment, what you're going to find is that there's clearly been an illuminating gas leak. And the windows are open, and they're trying to air the apartment out, and you go through that very poor living room that I talked to you into the back bedroom, and there's a broken fitting on the wall that clearly is somehow pulled apart, and there's the body of a young woman in the bed, and she's been dead for some time, and she's stiff and cold and pale, and you take one look at that body, you say, this is not an illuminating gas death. Because
she's pale.
yes, thank you. That's right. So if you are killed by carbon monoxide, your skin is actually going to flush pink. And in fact, people who look at corpses after a carbon monoxide death will talk about how healthy they look, right? And why is that? Carbon monoxide, let me see if I can, I skipped. I have a DJ. So when you breathe in, right, carbon monoxide, you normally breathe in oxygen. Oxygen attaches to a protein a metalloprotein in your blood called hemoglobin. It's the protein that makes your blood red, and the hemoglobin carries the oxygen through your bloodstream and delivers it to all the cells. Carbon monoxide has a much stronger affinity to hemoglobin than oxygen. It's about 200 times as strong. So if you're in a room that has a lot of carbon monoxide and you are breathing, even though you're breathing in oxygen, your blood will not carry it because the carbon monoxide will crowd it out. And essentially what you die of with carbon monoxide is a chemical suffocation. And when that happens, it's such a strong chemical reaction that your blood actually changes color, and it turns an incredibly strong cherry red pink. And it's so strong that if they do an autopsy, it's changed the color of your organs internally, but your skin flushes. And you will actually be the healthiest corpse that anyone has ever seen. So what happens in this case is that they take the body back to the morgue, and they do a blood draw. There's no carbon monoxide saturation, but there's an extremely high level of another gas, and that gas is carbon dioxide. And so if you find a corpse and it has an extremely high level of carbon dioxide, what does that tell you? Yeah. Yes, this is a very smart room. So if you think about the way we breathe, inhale oxygen, exhale carbon dioxide, what if you can't exhale? Right? So one of the giveaways of asphyxiation, strangulation, and suffocation is a high level of carbon dioxide in your blood. So when they found that out, unlike the kind of fancy stuff you see in like the CSI TV shows today, this is an autopsy sketch from 1923, and it's a little hard to read, but every one of those lines pointing at the back of the neck of the body says abrasion. And what they found was the fingerprints of her husband in the back of her neck. What he had done is suffocated her. He'd taken out an insurance policy. He'd suffocated her with the pillow, and he held it down so hard here that he'd left the marks of his fingers in the back of her neck, which is what you see here. There's a few on her arms from the initial struggle. So once they put all this together, they went back to him. He confessed, and he went to jail for murder. And that is a purely chemical detection story. And that was something that they were really figuring out back in the day. And these guys went on to, and I have another incredibly gruesome story that I'm going to skip because I don't want to go too long. But Gettler and Norris were the first, they did the first test to show that someone was drunk at time of death. They did some of the first work with wood alcohol and the way that it damages the brain. And one of the other things, because they did a lot of occupational health stuff they did, is in 1925, they moved to get lead taken out of gasoline. And in fact, they did such an effective job of showing that tetraethyl lead, which was an additive into gasoline to prevent knocking, that it was so neurotoxic that they persuaded the city of New York to ban leaded gasoline in 1925. And then they worked with medical scientists in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia banned leaded gasoline in 1926. And then what happened was that the oil and gas companies and the automobile companies went to President Hoover, who was a very laissez-faire, no regulation president, and he appointed an all-industry board to review the safety of leaded gasoline. And they found that there's no problem with being exposed to lead. And so they, reintroduced lead into gasoline late in 1926. And it was not taken back out of lead until about 1970. And it was mostly actually taken out of gasoline in 1970 because of the invention of the catalytic converter, which cannot process leaded gasoline. But the EPA banned it. But Charles Norris tracked the deposition of lead throughout the city until he died in the mid-30s because of leaded gasoline. So it's really an amazing time, right? And these guys do groundbreaking work. But the story that I'm telling you is in part to show you how I'll use a story to teach you a little bit about chemistry, right? How does carbon monoxide work? Or how does it kill you? And so one of the things we think a lot about in narrative writing is, how do I weave this into the story so you're going to come out knowing a lot about chemistry, or at least a lot about carbon monoxide and how it kills you, but it's all embedded in a murder story. So Poisoners Handbook is, in fact, a series of murder stories and occupational health stories in which I'm basically weaving the background of the chemicals into it, right? And after I wrote that book, and a lot of my friends would say, well, I was influenced by, Tolstoy or other great writers. And I was influenced by Agatha Christie, right? I mean, she was like my guiding spirit throughout that book. So I want to talk a little bit about a book I did before that, Love at Goon Park. One of the things that's wonderful about a book is that you have the room and the space to really explore an issue and what I think of as the story behind a story, right? So a lot of times you have the story on the surface, a murder or a scientific paper or a decision, and then there's the story that lies behind it. And science is a very human enterprise. I mean, one of the things that I think we don't do justice to with science, if we don't acknowledge this, is that science is a human enterprise. It's people trying to understand the world around them, right? All of us do this in different ways, and science has advanced tools and techniques to do so, but in that sense, we're all trying to figure out what the world is like and how it works and how to, do what we do better. So that, science fits right into that. And in that sense, because it is a human enterprise, you get all kinds of stories of, brilliance and politics and confrontation and mistakes and generosity and non-generosity. I mean, it's an incredibly fascinating human story. And so a book really gives you room to explore science in that way. And this story, Levitt Goompart, is the story of an eccentric, chain-smoking, alcoholic, poetry writing, philandering, brilliant psychologist. And it's also the story of the idea that love matters. And so, which was something that psychology completely did not believe in the early 20th century. So when you go back and look at the scientific, like the psychology textbooks of that time, you'll find that, in fact, none of them use the word love. The term for the relationship between mother and child at that point was proximity. And if you go and you look at the child raising textbooks of the 1920s, they are very specific about the fact that mothers should not hold their children, that too much contact will ruin them emotionally, and that if you hear your child crying, you should not be cuddling, you should not be picking up your child. And you can actually go into the 1930s in some of the medical journals and have doctors say, I cannot get mothers to hold their child because they are so afraid of doing permanent emotional harm to them. So at this period, we have my psychologist, Harry Harlow, and he worked primarily in primates, and he decided to take that issue on. I mean, he basically said, at some point, psychology has to catch up with common sense. And the most famous talk he ever gave was in 1948. It was called, no, wait a minute, maybe 1958, sorry, The Nature of Love. And it was about the fact that love was, in fact, something that and love and contact and affection were absolutely necessary for normal development. And that really was the basis of his work. However, wait, one more minute, go back, sorry. If you look at this cover, if you actually had the hardback book, there was this weird little cutout with the strange face looking through it. And if you opened up and took off the paper cover, now go ahead, what you would see is this. So these were Harlow experiments. He did almost all of his work with baby monkeys, right? He was hugely controversial, poster child for the animal rights movement. And what this baby monkey, this is an experiment in which they put these little baby monkeys in a kind of box with a sliding window. And then he had created these, they were like, he called them surrogate mothers, but he had a cloth mother and a wire mother. Right? And I'll show you a picture of the baby with the cloth mother, but they were little statues, essentially. And he was testing the affection of these babies for their mothers. And this was an experiment in which they would, the baby monkey could push a lever to see its mom. And these guys would do it so much that the students in the room who were running the experiments would fall asleep. And the baby monkeys would still be here trying to open that window and see their mom. So if you turn to the next slide now, this is a picture, right, of a cloth mother. And they're really, I mean, Harlow's work in a lot of ways, is really troubling when you're reading it because you cannot help but empathize with these baby mothers. But this particular experiment was about the fact that children need to be held. And so what he did is he created cloth mom here. This was warmed by a light bulb and it was all soft and cuddly. And then he created a similar, mother that was made of wire that had the food. And then what he was just trying to say is that babies are always going to develop a bond with the person that they can hold on to who cuddles them. And this absolutely went against everything in science. People mocked him when he was working on this experiment. But when you go and look at the results of these, there's actually, I didn't bring one, but there's these amazing pictures in which the baby monkey is holding on to Cloth Mom, but leaning over sideways to get the bottle from Wire Mom, right? Because this is my mom. And so this idea of contact comfort changed the way that people started advising moms, right? You need to hold your children. And it also, he advocated very strongly in hospitals that parents need to go into the hospital, right? It was always, the mothers were not allowed into the hospital if they had a sick kid. So he used this work again to say, you are really screwing up these kids. You've got to let parents into the hospital. They have to be able to hold their children. You have to be able, and you see his stuff in all kinds of women's magazines while he's running this crusade. His experiments got darker and darker. He looked at what if your mother rejects you? He looked at what if you have no friends? He does all of this with monkeys, right, in ways that you just start going, could you stop, right? But he absolutely was part of a paradigm shift in psychology. So one of the things, and this is really important to me, and this is something, again, that a book will allow you to do. I have this idea, what am I willing to pay for information? If this is information that allowed us to change the way we care for children, am I willing to do this? Right? What are the ethical lines that I'm going to draw in acquiring information? And so he brings you right to that point. And I want to show you really briefly, this is an ebook I did. It's a Kindle single about a serial killer. and it raises the same question, what are you willing to pay for knowledge? And so this is about a very famous American serial killer, if you're into serial killers, called Albert Fish. He was a very successful killer of children in New York in the 1920s and 30s. They actually have no idea how many children he attacked and or killed. And he was completely crazy. He had rewritten the Bible in his own mind. He had angels that would float in his apartment. When he met with psychologists after he was captured, he was quoting the scripture that he had, it's incredibly violent scripture that he had invented, which was why we called this book Angel Killer. And he was most famous, and I won't tell you the details, but he was actually most famous with his later victims, in which he developed the habit of cannibalism. So when they caught him, there was an enormous, again, an ethical argument when he went to trial, which is, we have in our hands a really successful serial killer. He's evaded detection. He's incredibly smart. He's killed a lot of people. Should we put him into an institution and study him and figure out what made him so successful and protect ourselves against the next killer? Or should we kill him because what he did is so unforgivable that we just can't allow people like this to continue? And so the trial is this enormous morality play, and the testimony on both sides from the psychologists on either side, which was really what was interesting to me about this. What are you willing to pay, right? And I'll just give the story away by saying that we were not willing to pay that much in the case of Albert Fish. But the other thing I will say is, when you write a book like this, you are living with the characters in your, I mean, they're not characters, they're real people, but they inhabit your house. I used to think when I was writing about Harlow, of Harlow as like a fifth member of my family. And I always talked to him out loud. I would be like, Harry, why did you do this, right? And so my kids who were in the house when I was writing this book always called Lovegoon Park the Harry book. In this case, this is an 11,000 word piece as opposed to a 100,000 word book. I was not willing to do that with Albert Fish. I was not willing to have a serial killer in my house for 2 years it takes me to write a book. I really thought I would be a very strange person by the end of it. And so I wanted to do this story, but I made a deliberate choice to do it in this format so I could tell the story and I could move on. And so I want to mention something else that is really fascinating when you're a science writer doing a book, and that is it gives you a chance to add, to just really explore a question you find fascinating. So I did an earlier book on gender differences, Sex on the Brain, which allowed me to explore this question. If we're biologically equal, why does one sex have most of the power? What explains that? And if you read Sex on the Brain, you'll see that that really drives the book. How do we explain balance of power? This book was different. I got really interested in the fact that William James, who's a pillar of American psychology and philosophy, had spent so much of his life trying to prove the existence of life after death and hunting ghosts and meeting with mediums. And when I looked at that a little more, I realized that he was part of what I think of as the best ghost hunt in scientific history. It was the one period in sort of the cultural history of science when it was acceptable for very high-end scientists to say, I'm going to go chase ghosts. And so you had William James, you had Charles Richet, who won the Nobel for anaphylaxis, you had J.J. Thomson, who was the discoverer of the electron, you had Marie Curie in France, you had Oliver Lodge, who was one of the early inventors of radio. You had this incredible group of high-powered scientists. So my question here was really simple. What did they find? And can I lay out the evidence in a non-judgmental way that ghosts are real, right? I mean, both of those things were kind of dry. I mean, it wasn't that I was trying to prove ghosts are real, but I wanted to really sort of objectively look at what they found and what was real in what they found. And people would ask me when I was on book tour, they'd say, well, do you believe in ghosts? And I would say, I don't think that's the interesting question. I think the interesting question is, why do we see them? And why does when you go out through American history, in human history, every single civilization has seen ghosts. So if we could really understand that, wouldn't we understand ourselves a little better? So this book allowed me to explore that. The picture on the right is a spirit photograph. These were really famous and popular at the time. So you see that kind of vaguely female cone of light on the stairs, and so people would take these photos and then they would say, well, I saw a ghost, right? And this one actually was from, I think this house was in Pennsylvania or something. And then the cover of the book, where the medium is you see the scientist watching the medium, and the medium is essentially spinning light. That was a German medium. I actually don't know anything about her, because one of the things, again, about book covers is that they're going to pick the best illustration. And in my experience, I don't know about the rest of you who have written books, they never really care what I think. And so in this case, this medium was actually about 20 years after my story ended, but they just loved that picture with the light spinning between her hands. And so I'm like, but she wasn't even, and they're like, never mind you, right? And that actually happened to me in a different way with the cover of Monkey Wars, which is about monkeys, duh. But if you look at the cover Oxford did, it's a chimpanzee. And so I'm like waving my arms, it's not a monkey. And they said, we just don't like the way the monkeys look. They don't look back at you. And chimpanzees look back at you, and therefore, and lots of people don't even know the difference between an ape and a monkey, and they're not going to care. And so, but I did, right? And I'm not positive, well, I'm still ranting about covers, but there might be some copies of Sex on the Brain out there. I think that's one of the books. So if you look closely at that cover, the paperback cover, it's a sperm and an egg kind of effect, but if you get really close to it, it's actually a chicken egg and a tadpole. And so I'm forever looking at that and going, that sperm has eyes, and that is so creepy, right? And just to totally ruin the cover for you. But I mean, covers are a really interesting experience. So if you move this forward, this is my book that's coming out in September. It's coming out on September 25th. I'm actually going to do a shtick about it at the Harbor Springs Book Festival about 3 days after it comes out, which is going to be fun. And I had no input on this cover either, but I don't hate it. So this is the most political book I've done. I mean, I hope it's the last book. 6 books is enough for any Well, at least it's enough for me. And this is about the invention of food safety at the turn of the 20th century. And so what I really wanted to look at this in this book, it follows America's first great food safety chemist, who is a chemist named Harvey Wiley. And it looks at what food was like before regulation and the fight to get any kind of minimal regulation of food and the immediate corporate corruption of regulation as soon as the 1906 Food and Drug Law passed. And I spent a lot of time in the National Archives and at the Library of Congress reading through you know, letters and telegrams and internal discussion documents and trying to put this story together. And so what a lot of people don't really know, and I'm going to just touch on briefly, is before the fairly basic 1906 Food and Drug Act, which was the forerunner of what would eventually lead us to the FDA, there was no national regulation of food, and anyone could put anything in food without safety testing, and did. So one of the more popular food preservatives of the time was formaldehyde. And people would use it. Formaldehyde, I've never actually drunk it, but apparently it has a fairly sweet taste. And so people would put it into milk. The sweetness would disguise the taste of the rot, and the reaction between the formaldehyde and the milk would actually disguise some of the decomposition of the milk. And so they did a lot of putting formaldehyde in milk. They had epidemics of child deaths in the United States, especially in the 1890s, from what they called embalmed milk. So that was part of it. They had this insane array of food additives, none of which had been tested. Any of them could and were put into food. A lot of them poisoned people. And the other thing was that there was widespread fraud. I mean, we have some food fraud today, but for example, when my scientist and his group was testing, I'm going to pick coffee because I love coffee. So ground coffee was usually about half sawdust or other fakeries, and then they discovered that people were starting to use coffee beans instead, and so there was a whole industry in faking coffee beans. They'd made them mostly out of dirt and wax, and so you would go to the barrel full of coffee beans, and you can actually find the flyers to grocers who would have these big barrels of coffee beans about how much money they could save if they would just mix these fake beans in them, and the same with flour, which was often gypsum. And there was a lot, again, you'd see advertisers to bakers, I keep doing that, saying, hey, you know, your flour will look a lot whiter if it's full of stone. And so it was just this crazy kind of fakery and use of toxic substances. And so, thank you. I wanted to share, this is a candy factory pre-regulation, which, as you can see, was not exactly maintained to the highest standards. This is a notebook of a food inspector from about 1893 or so, which is talking about the poisons in candy and the children who have died. You'll see there's that one line, child died. And so there were a lot of toxic chemicals, especially used to color candy. Arsenic, which I was just going on and on about, makes a very beautiful green dye, and they use arsenic in candy. Lead makes red and yellow, so they did a lot of lead coloring of candy, and children died, and it was totally legal. So my guy and some of his friends are like on this big crusade to try to push this forward, and I wanted to show you, this is some of the cartoons which had to do with a scandal about meat. In the 1990s, this is the 1890s, and you'll see on the one with the kind of monster where it says Packingtown. Packingtown, these were the Chicago meat packers, and the part of Chicago where all of the meat industry was based was known as Packingtown, where they would put meat into cans and packages and stuff. And the Beef Trust was another name, again, for the meat packers. This became a bigger and bigger problem. There was a huge scandal about this kind of meat. Following the Spanish-American War, when a lot of soldiers were poisoned by the meat that came out of Chicago, and the Army had hearings on what they called embalmed beef because of the formaldehyde issue. And eventually, all of this blows up. There was a novelist, some of you probably know his work, Upton Sinclair, who wrote a book called The Jungle, which was a novelization of the Chicago packing town problems, right? And that also played a role in eventually leading to regulation. So my book is really looking at the resistance to regulation, the influence of industry, which was huge in fighting it, different presidents, Taft and Roosevelt in particular, and then what happened when these kind of minimal regulations went through, and what happened to my scientists. And that is a really interesting period for me because it lays down some of the fundamental principles of how we regulate for food safety in this country and the way we continue to operate today. And in fact, the food colorings that they finally approved in this 1906 law, which are aniline coal-tar derivatives, right? Red dye number 7 and all of these are actually based on compounds that are derived from coal tars. We use those same ones today. The list of approved dyes by the FDA were actually the list of approved dyes in this 1906 law. So we still see this echoing down the way we deal with food safety today. And I'm actually kind of excited to talk about this. This is an interesting time to talk about regulation, but it also makes one other point that I think that is really important, which is that science does not exist often in a vacuum over here. It's part of our everyday life. It influences choices we make. It illuminates decisions we make about how to navigate. The more we understand that and the more we just enjoy it, because it is really interesting stuff, the more we'll be able to make smart decisions about ourselves and our future and the future of the planet. And my last pitch is that, books are a wonderful way to get out this. And I have one slide that I really love, which is a quote from Mark Twain. And which what I want to say to you is, I'm not saying to you, you have to read my books. Of course, that would be great. But, read books. There's a world in every one of them. You'll be so glad you did. Thank you. And I'm happy to answer. I've covered a whole lot of different issues, but I really am happy to answer any questions you might have about poisons or food or books or primates, or ghosts, yeah.
I'm really curious about your process. Like, when you start a book, do you all your research first and then start writing, or do you just start writing and then decide on what research you're going to do and what direction the book is going to take?
So that's a great question, and if you didn't hear it, is there a particular process? Do I do all my research first? Do I kind of dive in and let it unfold as it goes? So nonfiction writers, so I've always been what they call a trade book writer, which is, not academic, but sort of out there in the popular publishing end of things. And generally what you do, especially when you're selling your early books, is you write a proposal. And that proposal is an outline of the book you want to do. Usually you start it with some compelling story. I'm a narrative writer, so I'll start my proposals when I do them with what I think is a great story from the book. And then I will open it up to say, and this is just one example of these amazing stories I want to tell, and here is the issue, and here's the research I've done. Here's a basic sort of way I see the chapters unfolding. And you do something like that. I work with an agent, and that is circulated to different publishers. If you're lucky, this is early on, they'll do an auction. And then you go with the publisher you like best or whatever, and you have some sense of where you're going to go from that early research that illuminates the proposal. A proposal is like a tiny slice of what the book is going to be, and the standard ones run 25 to 40 normally pages. Some of them, I mean, I've had friends who've written 100-page proposals, which I think is crazy because that's basically a third of their book, but it kind of depends on how you're thinking your way through the process. It changes. When I did the book proposal for Sex on the Brain, I kind of knocked it out in a big hurry, and once I looked at it, I thought, man, this is boring me, right? I don't like this idea at all, and I wouldn't want to read this book. So I actually rethought the book and went back into that question of balance of power. Then I went back to my editor, I was with Viking then, and I said, this book is not going to be anything like the proposal. And she literally said to me, well, Deborah, it's only a proposal, right? I'm like, okay then. So sometimes you really think out a nonfiction book in advance, and you use that to your advantage in persuading someone to buy your book. What happened to me, and I totally don't recommend this, so I've had the same editor. I published by an imprint of Penguin called Penguin Press, and I've had the same editor for Ghost Hunters, Poisoners Handbook, and now the Poison Squad. And so after I did Ghost Hunters, which I wrote a full proposal for, my agent said to me, why don't you just stay with Anne, who's, a good editor, and you guys get along, and don't write a proposal. Just write her a note about this. And she knew I wanted to do this poison book. Write her a note about that poison book you're always going on and on about. And she said, make it 2 or 3 pages and make it delicious. And so as a writer, I was like, ooh, could I do that? Could I sell a book that was on 2 really good pages? I'd never even thought of that. And so I wanted to write this book about poisons, right? I went to the library, pulled a bunch of books, and I wrote this very delightful little thing about how I wasn't planning to poison my husband, but if I did, here's how I would do it, and did all this. I mean, it was very cute. And she bought the book. And then I spent the advance. So normally, you get an advance against what you hope will be your royalties that is supposed to support you while you're writing the book, or partially support you, or minimally support you. I mean, it's like ever a game. But I had already, but in no time flat, I'm like, oh, I have this advance. I'm just going to spend it. And then I literally sat down and thought, what is this book about? Right? Am I writing an encyclopedia of poisons? What story am I telling? I had no idea. It was just kind of poisons are cool, let me tell the story. And so I spent about 3 hysterical months after I'd already sold the book trying to figure out what the book is about. I usually don't recommend that. It was really stressful. And I was reading through the back newsletters of the Society of Forensic Toxicologists when I found this reference to Alexander Gettler, who was that toxicologist I showed you the picture of, being the father of American forensic toxicology. And so I went, oh, that's terrific. I'll just go get a biography of him, but there was none. And so that book I put together like a mosaic. So that was I sold the book and then I did the research, and I went, man, I was reading toxicology journals of the time and finding bits and pieces, and I hunted down his family, who turned out to have a lot of diaries and stuff in a closet, and I went to the archives, the New York City Municipal Archives, where they had archived a lot of letters, and I did rain dances outside. They didn't talk to me. I mean, I just went everywhere trying to put this book together. And there was actually one point, I had structured the book. If you look at the structure of that book, I knew how I wanted to structure it. It was going to be the story of these 2 pioneering scientists, but it was also going to be the story of a whole collection of really dangerous poisons. And so if you read the book, every chapter is a poison. And so I'm moving forward the story of Gettler and Norris. This is really hard to do as a writer. And at the same time, I'm dropping back to tell the story of these poisons. So every chapter is about a case that they encountered that includes the backstory of that poison. So there's like a mysterious cyanide death, and there's actually an arsenic murderess who comes up early on and then returns at the end of the book. And so my brilliant structure was that I would bring in Fanny Creighton, who was an absolutely horrible person, and introduce her with her first killing, and then the book would end with the second killing. If she gets away on the first one, she's convicted on the second one. It seemed like a brilliant way to end the book, except when I actually got to that point, I realized that the timing was wrong, and that her murder was way too late for the way I wanted to tell that story, and that I needed another poison. And so I went and I'm going through all of Gettler's cases, and I find this poison in this story about thallium, which is a great poison in its own way. And I went bolting down. I just want to give a shout out to reference librarians. I went bolting down to the medical library at the University of Wisconsin, and they had a medical history librarian. And I'm like, oh my God, I need to tell me about thallium. Find me lots of things about it. And she just gave me stacks of information about thallium science in this period, and I was able to write that chapter. And it's really an amazing story of a non-murder, but a guy who was suspected of killing his entire family. And then, so you know, it's you feel your way through some of it. You know what you're doing with some of it. You insanely gamble, as I did with others of it. None of these, and I've been different on every book. I've had books where I knew exactly where I was going, and I've had this book where I had no idea what I was doing, right, except that I loved the idea and I knew I was going to figure out a way to tell it. So that is a long answer to your story that is probably not as helpful as you hoped. But yeah.
I know everyone knows that there are science deniers and environmental issues.
Yes.
And I'm a retired obstetrician and gynecologist and have a strong interest in endocrinology. I've done a lot of reading in this area. And it seems to me that there's a lot of science denying in the gender dysphoria and what's happening to young children today, misdirected. And I wonder if anyone could. I just said that I know that everyone knows that there is a lot of science denying in the environmental issues.
Yes.
And I'm a retired obstetrician and gynecologist, and a lot of endocrinology in my background that I've studied. And I think there's a lot of science denying in the gender dysphoria arguments and all that's going on about some of the transgender things. And I just wonder if anyone is doing anything like that, or if your book touches on any of that, your book and section.
I mean, science is not denying in understanding the role of hormones and how they shape gender or function on the gender spectrum.
And how young children are being given violence when it's not an anatomic issue, it's not a hormone issue, it's really a psychological issue, and they're doing violence to their bodies by what they're trying to do. And I just think that's a real denial of the science.
It has, you know, and I agree with that. I mean, and I do think this is a field we're just trying to work our way through. And I know that, you know, there was a psychologist, John Money, you know his work, who completely believed that he could change the gender. I mean, a lot of his patients committed suicide. So when you're saying violence, I get that. I mean, I do think that it wouldn't hurt us to step back and try.
You can masculinize a female or change the other way, but you're not really changing things. You're just something to modify and destroy real life.
And I think, you know, that we need to tread very carefully in this area, because I don't think we fully understand it. And actually, this is not exactly your question, but I wrote a piece for a magazine last year. I was just talking about this at lunch or something, that won, so I'm going to Chicago, that won the Medical Writing Award from the Endocrine Society of America. And it's about soy. And so this was called the Great Soy Experiment, in which I was looking at a lot of studies that showed that children who are raised on soy formula, you start actually altering their development. We don't understand this, but exactly how things work. And so I was talking to a researcher at NIH. And I said, well, so are we running an accidental experiment in human development? Because when you actually look at the structure of soy formula, soy is high in phytoestrogens, right? We actually, our hormone receptors will actually bond to those pretty effectively. And so they're very good endocrine disruptors. And if you look at the content of, say, cow's milk, which most of us drink, or human breast milk, versus soy, the number of phytoestrogens in soy formula and soy milk are 4,500 times or more the amount that we get in regular milk or breast milk. So if you are feeding a tiny developing human this super high dose of estrogen several times a day with formula, that's why I said, are we experimenting? And when you get to look at some of the results they're just starting to find, I mean, they are finding these really interesting, discrete changes. Now, once your reproductive system is in place, it's not so much of an issue, right? But I'm now talking to doctors who's, especially specialists, endocrine specialists, who now go out and they say to moms, unless your child really has to be on soy formula for medical reasons, don't do it, right? Wait until they are more fully developed, because we are really seeing these experimental results. And what I don't think we've done well, and I think it's true in almost all science denial kinds of things, there's a fundamental question: how do we educate people about these issues, right? And I'd like to see us go back and think more about how we educate, this is one of my soapboxes, at the K-12 level, so that we aren't alienating people from science by the time they get out of high school. You're not smart enough to take all these classes. You're not smart enough to do this. So, science just makes you feel stupid, and people move away from it and dismiss it. And there's got to be some kind of corrective, I think, for us to deal with these denialism issues across the board. So that's a kind of general answer to your question, but you raise a real point. So.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm done. And thanks. I didn't look at the folder at all. And I will be lurking around. I'm happy to sign books. I'm happy to answer other questions. I think there's a reception, so if you didn't get a chance, come ask me. I'd be happy to talk further. Thank you again so much. So.